Hello, Amy.
Hi.
I'm Mark.
It's so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about you. Your bio says you're born in Kansas City. That's my hometown. So I
Oh,
wondered, like,
really?
what part or?
Last time I was there was probably when I left, maybe.
Okay.
And that was when I was like 12 years old or
Oh,
something
geez.
like that.
Long time.
So I remember, we lived outside of the city, like Crestwood.
Mm.
It's out by Red Bridge, I
Okay.
remember.
Mhm.
Um, I went to South City View was elementary school.
Okay.
I remember going to the plaza and seeing the Christmas lights as a kid.
Yep.
I remember field trip, I don't know what school or what grade, but it was grade school, where you get put on a bus and they drag you to the art museum. So I do remember that, going to the Nelson Atkins and I remember, it's funny as a kid what you remember from those kind of trips. And I remember because the air condition was cranked up in a rotunda, paintings were up really high, so it's like none of us could really even look at them.
Mm.
So that was kind of my youthful experience at the Nelson Atkins
Mm-hmm.
Museum.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I think at that age, it's really hard to appreciate what it's all about,
yeah, and especially if there's nobody giving you any particular insight as to why you're there and
Yeah.
what is interesting about being there.
But
But
it is
after
great.
Kansas City, we moved to St. Louis, so it's still in
Ah,
Missouri.
yeah,
I don't know if
right.
you have
Okay.
ever been to St. Louis, but that's pretty
Yeah.
much where I really kind of grew up. After high school, this was in St. Louis. It was a waste of 4 years in high school. It was just a production line. Everybody learning the exact same thing, the exact same way, so they can go off and get the exact same factory job when they get out of school. So I didn't, I wasn't a very good student. So at the end of high school, I had no clue what I was interested in doing. Art was never anything that was really
Mm-hmm.
in my family. It was not really promoted or we weren't exposed to it in high school. So I really didn't know what to do. So, I thought, well, I'll go to community college, which was close by. And I think my dad was really grateful for that I was going to school because he was so afraid that I was going to go into the military because the Vietnam War was winding down. So right at that point, these recruiters have these lists, I guess, of all the guys who are graduating high school. So they start calling them up and saying, "Hey, you want to drive a tank? You want to fly an airplane?" And what goofy 17-year-old kid doesn't want to fly an airplane? So my dad was terrified that because he'd been in the military all his life, so he was terrified I'd do something crazy like go off and do that. So he was grateful to support anything, with school. So I went to community college and I was interested in botany, so I was thinking about getting involved in that, but I didn't really like botany. I still like plants and growing things, but I didn't like learning Latin and phylums, and it really didn't have much to do with the plants I was interested in approaching. So I took some botany classes and realized that was not the niche. So I always liked drawing and painting as a kid, but never thought of it as a vocation. It was just like, oh, this is fun. So I took some art classes and it just never ended up being a conscious choice. It was just something that I took one art class, take another art class, go to graduate school, take more classes, get a job at university, teach art classes. So it was never a career choice. It was just sort of something that I guess if you lack enough, you do it well enough that somebody somehow appreciates it. So, so anyway, I went to a small community college in St. Louis 2 years, then went 2 years to a really small private college in St. Louis called Fontbonne. You're supposed to say what? Everybody says what when you say Fontbonne. It's like French for some fountain or something like that.
Ah.
So it's a Catholic, it used to be a girls' school, but when I got there, it just turned to male-female school, and it was tiny, 800 students in the whole school. So I was really lucky. I had a couple of good art teachers there that I really, enjoyed working with. it was close to St. Louis Art Museum. They put very little demands on you other than just doing your work. And, you know, so I was there for 2 years. And then, you know, this was for internet and anything like that. So you didn't have any knowledge of much about any other programs or universities. So at some point, professor said, well, why'd you think about going to graduate school? And I had no idea what that entailed or what it was about. So I applied to 2 schools. I got in at Indiana University and was there for 2 years. And, you know, again, very little demands on you other than just making your artwork. And it was like perfect. Mm-hmm. So was there for 2 years. And then we moved back to St. Louis, doing odd jobs, little adult education, teaching classes, stuff like that. And then a friend suggested I apply to this position here at Florida State. So I did. You know, really not concerned about the job or anything. But then turned out they liked me and they liked my work. So I've been here since 1985. And, wow. You know, teaching is not that much different than sort of being in school. I mean, you're doing what you like doing and you're talking about things you like talking about. And you know, it never even seemed to be a job. It was something that took up time, but it was never like a job sort of nightmare thing. Mm-hmm. But all that aside, you know, I'm still sort of really glad to be retired because, you know, again, the only problems I have to deal with are my own. Mm-hmm. So I was telling Alec, this is my studio in the background. So this thing on an easel right now is what I'm working on. And the thing, I don't know, on this wall is one that I've done since the work was, you know, sent to the museum. So I just keep painting. I do it every day. But I don't think it was a job. I don't know what I would do if I wasn't doing it. You know, I just can't imagine. So.
I think the botany is really interesting. I didn't realize that you were interested in botany. So I could see that in the paintings. Have you always had the kind of the focus on environmental use?
You know, I think it was always an interest in the plants and the animals. And I think, you know, certainly nowadays to have your interest in either one of those things, it ends up evolving into some environmental concerns because that's what we have to deal with now. You know, if it's out there, we have to save it, whether it's an animal or a bird or a lake. You know, we control the planet, and you know, that's in my work, but I don't think of myself necessarily as an environmental artist. I mean, if I was a full-blown environmentalist, you know, there'd be better ways to demonstrate that, I suppose. I mean, you know, be a lobbyist, be a politician, be a environmental lawyer. You know, so I'm an environmentalist, but my work is not environmentalistic, I guess. That's where, you know, I think they're paintings, and, you know, anybody's painting, you know, is a thing in itself, and it has its own set of requirements and criteria and problems and solutions. So I'm a painter first, interested in that, and it just so happens that I'm also interested in the birds and the landscape, particularly of North Florida right now. And I wasn't that particularly interested in those subjects until we moved to Florida, you know, growing up in the Midwest. I mean, Amy, you know this, there's nothing up there except lawns and cornfields and, you know, robins and rabbits. I mean, everything else has been chased off, chopped down, or has moved away. So it wasn't until we moved to North Florida where, you know, those things still exist, the large herons and the egrets and the alligators and the panthers and the bobcats. And in the paintings, they're all things that I've seen to some degree. I mean, you know, I don't go snorkeling with the alligators underwater. I don't know if you can make that out. It's, you know, But I know those things are there, and I can imagine what that world must be like. There are artists that make work about art. There's artists that make about art that's going on in New York City. There's artists that make art that has to do with evolving technologies. And then there are artists that deal with things that they see and think and feel about every day. And I think I'm the latter. I like painting, always have. I think because it's so primal, it's not that much different than things that cavemen would do. We were just using pigment and vegetable oil and smeared on a piece of cloth. And I always like the ability to convince people of what they're looking at. They don't see dirt on a canvas, they see a bird or they see a landscape. And I always like that magic. I like to do sculpture, but sculpture is somehow a little too real for me. It has a space, it has a weight, it has a mass, it has a volume. You can walk around it. So it doesn't have an illusionistic ability to convince people and strange things about it, like I do painting. So.
Yeah, so I like that you say this eyewitness aspect of it, especially because one of the things that I think struck me, and I had a student who I assigned all of my grad students to go and do a critical review of someone's art that they could see. It could be some of their colleagues or whatever. And I had a student, Anne, who wrote on your pieces in the museum.
That's fine.
And she did a great review. And I think for somebody like her or me, seeing all of that Florida green, and like you said, the big animals that we don't have. We have some big animals here too, and we have to kind of come to terms with, the snakes in the canyon or whatever. But the colors are so foreign regionally for someone who's grown up here. And I think that that's really interesting, how into the regional you are, and that, like you said, you can go outside and in your area and witness these things. It's not something that you're just looking at in books. But at the same time, you're not, like you said, snorkeling next to the animal. There's still this distance between their world and your world, but you collapse these worlds into your pieces. So I don't know if that warrants a comment, but I think it, the green and blues just shock around here because we have so little green.
See, I like that explanation, the idea of how you phrased it, of these things sort of being too different, but somehow coming together and being about a place or about a thing without trying to document it too specifically. And the color, I don't know, you can see this is always backwards, pointing over here. Whoa, the color thing, it's just something that I've always enjoyed. When I was in school, I was interested in painters like Bonnard and the Fauvists and stuff like that. So I think maybe that might be some genetic makeup thing or something, the gravitating towards a certain palette of colors. But it seems to work for me with the subject matter of and there's a certain element of the romantic too. I like the romantic painters. So, I have no hesitation about painting sunsets or rainbows. It's stuff that, when you're in school, you're told you can't paint a sunset. You can't paint a rainbow. It's just, it's like you can't paint kittens. I don't know if I'd paint a kitten, but it's probably in that same category of things not to do because they've either been overdone or they're too saccharine or just goofy. But, I think at some point what I'm interested in is trying to do things goofy and wrong, but in just the right way. And I think that gives me some opportunity to do things differently than a lot of other artists. And, sometimes I look at my work and think, God, that's just damn goofy and confusing. And other times I can go, whoa, I finally got close to whatever it is I'm trying to get towards. And, part of that is really trying to be conscious of not looking like anybody else and anybody else's work. So I think there's enough weirdness to it and self-solutions that it keeps them from being too familiar with many other artists out there. So some of that certainly happens with the predella boxes across the bottom,
yeah,
or the little sculptures in this case, instead of the box, shadow box format, like a couple in the show have the sculptural elements across the bottom. So there's an element of the humor and weirdness of folk art that I like. I can never claim to be a folk artist because I don't even know if there are any real folk artists anymore. I mean, everybody's so connected and everybody's so media savvy, unless you live on a mountain disconnected from the internet and you don't have a cell phone, maybe you can be a folk artist. But folk art's, has a place certainly of importance in Texas. It certainly does. There was a painter or artist named Howard Fenster, pretty well-known folk artist from Georgia. And I do like the folk art willingness to try things, like I use broken mirrors and glitters. I mean, that's almost like trademark folk art stuff.
You know what else it reminds me of, though, especially with the objects surrounding the frame and in the shadow boxes, is things that were like, and you mentioned a little bit of the like Renaissance or early modern inspiration, but like what we would call the Kunstkammer or the Natural History Cabinet of Curiosities. I mean, I've seen, like, I studied early modern art in grad school, and they'd have these rooms, like gentlemen would have these rooms filled with whacked out jars full of dragon's teeth and, the like the dinosaur type thing hanging from the ceiling, which they collected. I mean, and yet they would have shell collections and all kinds of things, it wouldn't be, organized in this way that was full of rationality and order, but something about it was both scientific, but also like you have the fantastical and you have the weird, like you said, and it's all in there. But I think on the flip side of that too, you're tapping into something that like my child who is getting into video games can walk in and see all those colors and see that immersive environment and not feel like it's old fashioned, but feel like it's cutting edge right now. So you have that balance of like a long-standing tradition of collecting and observation and the weirdness of nature. But then on the other end, it's like the colors are sort of like, Avatar the movie or going to a 3D movie completely immersed in it. So I think it's like you've got both ends of that going on.
Well, that's a good response. I certainly, we don't have kids. I don't really think about kids at the forefront of anything I do, but I always enjoy hearing or seeing kids look at the paintings. And you're right, they do like those little shadow box things across the bottom, partly because they're at eye level, something I never had when we went to the museum as kids. It's all up there. So, here's the stuff down at their eye level, and it's a scale and a fairly recognizable narrative they can make some estimations about. But again, I guess it's a little self-serving, but I don't paint the paintings for anybody else. I do enjoy when people like them, but that's never, a question in my mind while I'm working on it. Gee, I hope somebody likes this, or I hope the gallery likes it, or I hope this is not too big for somebody to hang in the living room. And those things just, they probably should at some point, but they just never have kind of crossed my mind or been a concern. And that's a good thing about, teaching. I mean, it relieves you from those kind of concerns. You've got an income. You don't have to worry if anybody likes your paintings or if they're too big for people's guest room or something like that. So, but I am glad when, and I think, the shiny mirrors and the glitter again, I think children and people in general kind of get attracted to those things. And I'm not afraid of pulling those out of the bag and trying that stuff. As long as people don't get cut from the mirrors.
Yeah.
You know, talking about the botany and the plants, I mean, that's pretty much, you know, well, the three things I kind of do right now is certainly painting. I play a lot of tennis and work in my garden. So the longer I do both, I start finding a strange relationship between the way you garden things and the way you paint. You know, I don't grow vegetables, you know, it's too shady, too hot, too sandy here. So it's more about a kind of tropical garden, which is just as dense and confusing as these paintings at some point. So I really see a kind of interconnection between, you know, I guess it's not surprising, it's the same brain trying to juggle both those things. So it's not surprising, I guess, that they have a similar quality to them.
Now, could someone go up to your painting and identify this specific plant and this specific, like you said, the heron? I mean, are you being kind of like a naturalist in the way that you render the animals and plants?
Yeah, at some point, I'll look at like field manuals or things like that. I kind of have a group of characters that I keep using over and over again. I don't mean characters in sort of a human characteristic, but it's just certain birds, certain positions of the birds or animals I like. So I kind of keep using some of those over and over again, like over my shoulder. Oops, see if I do this backwards. That's a green heron. So that's probably any, person interested in birds would recognize that. Some tend to be a little more generic. I'm not that concerned about having the beak colors right or their leg colors right or a scale reference that makes sense. But I suspect, most of the birds and the mammals, I mean, people can figure out if they have any clue about birds or mammals. The bird right over, let's see which one, over my shoulder, right there. There it is, the yellow one. It's a goldfinch. So those are things that come through North Florida in the spring. So they're all things that, I've seen either in the backyard or when I go down to this National Wildlife Reserve and these paintings on the background, these little, 18 by 20 inch paintings, go down there and paint one of those every once in a while. And, it's interesting to sit and just paint and observe things because people don't do that much anymore, sitting and looking at things. And, you sit there and the birds stop paying attention to you and the animals stop paying attention to you. I was sitting down there one time with a friend and we were sitting there painting and we looked up and this bobcat just strolled right between us, because we're sitting there not moving, not, just because you don't move much when you're sitting there painting. And this bobcat walked between us. And, you see the bobcats at the zoos or some park or something like that. And they're just sort of laying around these overfed sort of house cats. But this thing, he looked like he was like an athlete. He had these shoulders and he was like, so confident, just marching through. And as soon as he was off in the bushes away from us, he just vanished. It's like, poof. So, a lot of those kind of instances work their way into the paintings. So I painted bobcat because I saw a bobcat, not because, I'm painting this bobcat doing what I saw. I'm just painting this bobcat in this world that I sort of visited. And it again happens with the birds. One time we were down there and painting and look up and a osprey flew over. Osprey is a hawk-like bird that dives into the water, catches fish, and flies off. That's their primary source of food is catching fish. So this osprey was flying, like making a beeline overhead, with a fish in its talons. And just a matter of seconds later, this eagle was chasing him. So the eagles, they're sort of, a bit of scavenger. So it's easy for him to get that osprey to drop that fish and eat it than for the eagle to try and catch his own fish. So he was chasing this osprey, trying to get him to drop that fish so he could have a free meal. So, something like that has been worked into a painting. The painting of the osprey and the eagle, they were all tangled up in this ball of feathers. But that observation of seeing that, is a catalyst to doing the painting. So sometimes they're as directly related to observation as they are from. Sometimes I'll just start making marks on a canvas and with a color and a brush, and it's the same brain always at work, so it starts to see the same more or less elements going on, and then the paintings start to take on a narrative based on that. Kind of like to see how they evolve, and like the painting behind me, I didn't know where that was going to start out. It's just kind of like, get out of your way. It just kind of just started. I think I started on Thursday, so they go really quickly.
I looked through your pieces, and how many of them have actual humans in them? Like, not very many. You have animals, and then you have representations of humans, but are there any humans?
I'm trying to think of those particular paintings. I don't know if there are. I mean, there's elements of humanity in them.
Right.
Almost probably every single one has a logging truck in the background. So here in the South, North Florida, they have tree farms where all your toilet paper and newsprint and all that stuff comes from.
I think it's so fascinating that the human viewer then sees themselves as almost the only human present. I think there's something really interesting about, like you said, humanity is absolutely there, but I'm the human that's seeing this. I don't know.
Yeah. That might be, part of my own nature. I have no problem with self-isolation. I kind of enjoy it to some degree. But like this painting behind me, it's got 3 people in it. I don't have to even figure them out, but there's a person, they're in a boat. So, as soon as you put a human in a painting, the painting becomes about the human. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to, compress the narrative that much. So, I tend to leave the humans out for the most part. And if they're in the painting, they're usually obscured by something, a light, a shadow, things in front of them. So they're just sort of like pushed back in there. And the humans are usually perpetrating some dark deed. They're not like, luncheon in the park kind of people. They're out there up to some mischief, and they're usually dealing in a unbeneficial way to the animals and the space they're in. So it's kind of a touchy thing with the humans in the paintings. I like to paint figures. I've done a lot of figure painting, but I don't really incorporate them too often into the large paintings. But
there is one recurring kind of a Greek bust that's typically underwater.
Yeah. Again, it's the idea of this cast of characters. And again, it's not a direct metaphor. And most of the things I use, if there is some kind of weird narrative to it, it maybe is open for different kinds of interpretations. Like what would a Greek sculpture bust be doing in the swamp here in North Florida? I mean, I don't know, but I like the idea of this bit of residue of human presence at some point. And the idea that there's a long footprint that everything has, and stuff gets built up over and buried and lost and forgotten about, and all that stuff is still out there at some point, whether it's our presence or the animals that used to be out there. So painting for me is this kind of a strange thing. You don't want to tell a story, you want to give clues, and you want the viewer to have enough clues that they can come up with their own narrative. It's different than movies or books, usually those things have a pretty consistent narrative that everybody understands by the time they get to the movie or they get into the book. And I think what makes art interesting is, the artist and the piece of artwork, that's only 2/3 of the equation. It really depends on what that viewer is bringing or willing to bring to the conversation. And that's something that I don't think the artist wants to control. If you do control it, you become an illustrator, which, they're great illustrators, but I have no interest in illustrating. So I want the paintings to be accessible, but at the same time, open-ended enough where people go, what the hell is this crazy thing about? But at the same time, I don't want it to be like just shotgun, like too many answers. I like to kind of rein it in where they get some sense of, well, this is about animals, or this is about environment, or this is about fish, or this is about, that smaller narrative, I guess, without really me preaching a perspective or how I think people should carry their lives.
But I think that's actually really powerful. You started out saying like that you're not an environmental artist and there's better ways to be an environmentalist, right? Like legal issues or protesting or something like that. But I think art is really powerful because of that open-ended, making us think, making us ask questions, not just about the world like out there, but also in here, like how do I relate to this scene? How am I also part of nature rather than the human and nature being like separate? I think that enveloping aspect of your work is powerful. And no, it might not be like taking it to court and trying to pass a law that protects the heron. But I think at the same time, art has such a powerful role to teach all ages and all people to think about the world.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's nice to hear that's how it comes across to you. And I think that's what I'm after. There's an artist named Sue Ko. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's an interesting artist. She works kind of monochromatically, almost in a cartoon illustrative style. And she's really about animal rights and the meat industries and the way that society treats animals. And she's much more of an illustrator slash propagandist. Is that a word? Propagandist? Propagandize, she really has this hardcore perspective on the ills of how we treat other living creatures. That's what her work is about. But that's her agenda. I mean, that's the way she talks when she talks about her work. It's about, the way we treat animals. And she happens to be an artist, But she's an interesting artist, but much more militant, I suppose. I mean, I'm anything but militant. We do give a lot of money to the Nature Conservancy, the Arbor Day, World Wildlife, so. And what we did is, we don't have kids, so, okay, what do I do with all these paintings? What do I do with all the investments? What do we do with house? What do we do with, all the stuff you accumulate over your life? So we dealt with a lawyer and we ended up figuring out that, whatever the final assets are when you check out, artwork, bank accounts, stocks, house, property, 90% of that going to the Nature Conservancy and 10% is going to Susan's brother. So, I always felt really good about that. I mean, you can do paintings about the environment. You can talk about the environment, but really it's a nuts and bolts kind of world. And And the way things are now, if anything's going to be saved in the natural world, it has to be bought and put aside. And it's not just enough to say, oh, we should save the eagle. Well, you have to buy the damn land for the eagle to live on. So.
Well, and I think that raises another question I was thinking about. You mentioned zoos earlier, and I think your paintings are so not zoo-like at all. They seem to be more like the borderlands between human and the wildlife, like, but bridges between them too. So whereas, like a zoo, as you said, there's this caged animal that seems lethargic and it can't do its thing. And then, but the animals in your pieces, they seem somewhat desperate, but they're also like still existing, surviving. And I loved your first statement. And when you were describing the animals, you used these words where the animal is like bold. I can't even remember the adjectives, but it was like these animals are surviving. They're not caged. So do you want to talk about that? I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that's important to me and important in the work. And you had mentioned the sense that there were some human footprints, attributes, someplace in the painting, even when they seem to be about the animals. So they really are about that point, either in time or in a physical sense, between our world and shopping malls and highways and clear-cut forests and these pockets of what's left of the natural world where these survivors are still hanging on. And again, it's like growing up in Kansas City, none of those survivors were still there. They had all been, maybe there were deer and rabbit and blue jays, but there were no native real animals left. They'd all been killed or chased off. Where when I moved to North Florida, again, they were still here. You can drive 20 minutes and see alligators and the blue herons and again, the bobcats and the bears. So it's that point in time between our ability to make a decision. Do we care about those things? Do we care about that forest, or do we chop it down and make a tree farm? And the assumption's always been, I guess, well-intended, that, we'll chop it down, make a tree farm, and those animals just move. But, now there's no place for them to move. So the paintings are kind of about that point that we're at right now between this weird imbalanced balance between us and our world and our self-servingness and those animals that are out there, fortunately maybe blind to their future, but they're still out there, managed to survive. And, I'm probably a pessimist about it, maybe a romantic pessimist if there's such a description. But, those are big topics, not like my paintings are like grandiose in terms of subject matter, but the idea of this world and this point that we're at in time right now between the animal and our survival and our willingness just to bore full speed ahead to the apocalypse. I kind of like that uneasiness in the paintings. I've always been interested in medieval manuscripts and books of hours. So some of those you look at and they're incredibly beautiful, and you look at it and you look at it and you go, God, there's a guy there with his skin being peeled off. So they're beautiful, but they're really unsettling about human nature in most cases. And I kind of like that aspect. I want people to look at them, like you said about the colors. And I think animals tend to attract people to some degree anyway. But then the longer you look at it, you go, there's something that is a little uneasy about this world that I'm looking at. And, I think that's the way I feel about the world. And, that is what's in the paintings. And the big paintings are certainly different than the small little landscapes. And those are the way the state wildlife reserve looks. I mean, it's nice. But that's a small part of the world anymore. I mean, everything else, there's too many people making demands on the planet. And I think that the big paintings are someplace between, this world back here and the world most of us spend our time in. And, our evolution can go either way. Probably won't be good.
So interesting too. The paintings are so good at showing you a spatial tension where the space is like thick and collapsed in on itself, and like within the frame there's just so much. But I didn't think about it being time, and I like how you said that, where it's also asking us about the time into the future and what we've done, and like this decision making about time, not just space. I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, I tend to be a bit of a pessimistic romantic, and I look at a lot of American landscape painters, particularly the ones who came to Florida like right after the Civil War. So you got people like Church, you got people like George Ennis, you got people like Martin Johnson Head, and they would come down here in the wintertime to escape the cold up north, and they would come down to St. Augustine, which is a city on the East Coast over by Jacksonville, where the train line came down after the Civil War. And that's about as far as most of them got at that point. And they would come down, they'd spend the winters down here, and they would paint, and they might paint for their keep. Flagler had he was responsible for the train line, and he had a big hotel over there, and they'd come down and do paintings, and they'd decorate his hotel. And they'd do paintings of the romantic landscape around North Florida over on the East Coast. And then it was orange groves, and other than that, it was all just tropical jungle. And even then, the painters saw that, the world was changing. People were coming down here, and the land was being cleared for more, development, citrus groves. So and it was right after the Civil War, so they could see the world changing. It was going, from what essentially had been an agrarian culture with very few people, all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War was changing everything. So they started to see that. And I think I'm kind of sympathetic to that cusp in time between what was and what is becoming. And I think those changes happen quicker now, almost so quick we don't recognize them. But I think we're at one right now. And maybe that is exemplified by the coronavirus. I mean, those things are going to keep coming up, things are going to come out of the jungles that have been buried in there for a bazillion years, but we're in there digging up, and swamps are getting changed, and viruses, microbes are coming up that, same thing in the tundra, the soil, the permafrost is melting. So there's things that have been encased in those worlds that all of a sudden we're going to be exposed to, for better or worse. And I just think this rate of change that we're dealing with, and maybe we're too close to it to even see it for sure. But I think it's one of those cusps between the way things used to be and how they hopefully adapt. So, and again, the paintings are not about happiness. They're not about apocalypse. They're maybe a little of both. And all that was really not consciously done. I mean, it just started the way my brain has started to think about the world, I guess. So, any other trick questions?
I think you answered everything I was thinking about. And I love your perspective on it. I think it's nice to talk to you, even if it's virtual. That's the best we can do right now. And
yeah. But it's fun to meet you both or see you both. I guess I've met Alec, but never actually seen him before. So it's nice to have a face to attach to an email. Nice to visit with you, Amy.
Well, I'm really glad you included me in this, Alex. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for doing it. Thank you both for taking the time to do it.
My pleasure. And again, nice visiting with you both. Hope I didn't just ramble on too much.
Not at all.
Rambles are good.
Yeah. Especially from artists. You always learn something.
I hope something.
I'm going to sign off. I have another meeting, but it was
All
really
right. Bye, Amy.